Hi guys, Alex and Elle here with the final part of my Norway series. Obviously there were two videos prior to this one of my hikes in the winter mountains in Norway, so this video is an image review where I'm going to critique some of the shots that I took on those two trips. But before I get started, I thought I'd mention that I've just returned from the Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa. And it was a really fantastic trip, which I vlogged throughout. So I actually spent 8 days and 7 nights camped up there with a group of other photographers who I'd invited along on a sort of adventure trip where I was able to do more of my own shooting, in contrast to workshops where I'm quite often tied up helping other photographers. So I have produced a number of hopefully videos from that trip, and I'm really excited about sharing that experience with you guys because it was a particularly successful one with some really fantastic conditions, and I did my best to explain my process and shoot some video of some of the amazing hiking that we did out there as well. So do keep an eye out for those videos. I'm hoping to release the first one on this coming Monday. So on with this image critique. This is the first image I'm going to discuss from Rundfjellet, which was the first mountain we went up, and this was the first shot I took that evening, trying to make use of this Rime Ice formation in the foreground here, with some fairly nice diagonal lines coming in from both the edge of the mountain here and this strong line of Rime Ice, to add a bit of dynamism to the foreground, and obviously the peaks at the top, adding that bit of interest and a sense of scale. There are a couple of points that I think I missed on this one. The first is that, I mean, this is more of a problem that I was trying to resolve at the time. This area in here, underneath this diagonal, is relatively empty. So to me, it creates a sense of imbalance, which I'm not entirely happy with. Although it's not a major issue, it's certainly one that I would seek to rectify if I could, but doing that would involve moving to the right and going higher, and that starts to open out this section here in the valley below. And one detail that I missed at the time is this plantation just here, which does distract a little bit. So I'm not quite sure about this image. It'll probably end up just sat there on my computer in perpetuity. This one I'm much happier with. A really beautiful natural color palette. The mountain in the back here is obviously that much higher than where I'm standing, and as a result it's getting stronger, warmer sunlight, a much richer, yellower, oranger sunlight, and you can see that gradient of color creeping up the mountain in this direction. Obviously I'm just making use of a very simple diagonal here, but one of the reasons that I think this particular foreground worked for me personally is this secondary gradient of color coming up in this direction. I love the way that fades from pink into blue with this relatively subtle but detailed texture. So although it's simple, I'm actually quite fond of this image, and it's very likely to end up in my portfolio. This one I've gone back and forth with, both loving it and disliking it in equal measure. I love the mountains in the back. I love this gradient of light, and in fact, you know, a tighter frame somewhere up here would perhaps have been a nice thing to shoot as well, had I had a sufficiently long lens with me. But I think this foreground is just a bit too strong and a bit too dull. These blue and grey combinations that you see in these crags with the blue snow, I just find it a little bit of a distraction from the main event, which of course is the mountains at the top here. And I have a different shot from later which I prefer of this scene taken in twilight, which I'll discuss now. This was the scene where I talked about repositioning myself on the mountain to align this ridge here with the peaks behind. And I'm pleased with how this has come out. I think the light and tonal balance is really nice, and blue hour is one of my favorite times to shoot snow, if not my very favorite time to shoot snow, because of this lovely directional soft light that you get and the rich colors, tones of blue that you get. I guess I'm a classic guy in many ways, and that blue is my favorite color. and I love the variation in blues you can get at twilight. So this is a little bit after sunset. You do have to wait a while for the light to take on that blue color, but when it does, it's well worth waiting for. And compositionally, I think this works much better than the previous image, because that foreground line does lend a sense of dynamism, and the foreground and background are actually tied together rather than being almost completely separate as they are in this previous image. So I'm now going to go through a few more images that I shot in changing light. Whilst the sun was up, as well as whilst the sun was down. This one is a tighter view of that first shot, so you can see these mountains here in the background. That's what I'm shooting in this image here. The light is pretty much ideal as far as I'm concerned, and I love the geometric pyramidal nature of these peaks. I mean, you kind of have these elements repeating themselves, and repetition is an idea which, if you can find it in your images, can be very effective from a compositional sort of integrity standpoint, the way that elements within an image work together and mirror one another. And so I really like that sense about this image, and I also like the way the light has just helped to perfectly outline some of these shapes to make them really prominent. So we've got this line continuing down here, this little lit edge, for example, and here we have a shadowed edge which just separates this mountain from the one behind, and similarly another shadowed edge here. And even where this mountain might risk blending into the one behind, we have quite a strong crag coming through here. So those shapes are actually really well identified, and I think that's what helps to make this image a successful one, even though it's comparatively simple. A minor point for me, a minor distraction, is these ski lines. This was actually one of the major areas in Lofoten where you could do backcountry skiing. I should mention, actually, if you've seen the pixels there, that's because this is a lower resolution image just for the purposes of this review. But yeah, it was a major ski area in Lofoten, and so quite a few people had skied down there during the day, which, depending on your opinion, is either a nice detail or an unwanted distraction. But I think for me, it's a perfectly acceptable thing to have in the image, and this one's probably going to go into my portfolio. If I wanted to lose the ski tracks, then this Blue Hour version certainly helps, because the ski tracks are not side lit. And you can see I've cropped this one differently. I'm doing that basically based on feeling more than anything else. I could have gone with either crop with both images, but this one felt a bit more geometric still to me. The color palette is that much simpler, so that's why I ended up with a different crop. It really shares most of the strengths and weaknesses of the previous image. You still get this lovely outlining effect and the geometric repetition, which I am quite fond of, but ultimately I think I prefer the sunlit version. Okay, now 2 shots of this island. It's a beautiful, beautiful subject on its own, and I think having these mountains in the background adds that extra element, because without them I think it would be quite a boring image. As much as the mountain is dramatic, you certainly don't want it out of context and on its own. I just don't think it's sufficiently interesting to really work in that sense, especially given how you're spoilt for choice in Norway. So I have 2 versions of this, both shot similarly. You can see the sunset image I actually decided to keep a bit more sky in, whereas for the Blue Hour image I lost more of that sky. I like both of them. I think, again, the sunlit image, that sculpting light just adds an extra element, but particularly to the mountains in the background. So that is the shot that I prefer. There are a few minor points that I would like to address in an ideal world. Obviously I could have shot wider so that the entire island is resolved within the frame, but then other elements started creeping in. So I mean, it would be great if the island ended here and here, and I could leave a bit more space on the left. It doesn't, and I think it's still fairly well contained. Ideally, I wouldn't want these clashes here between the island and the background, but obviously you can't go any higher than the summit of the mountain that you're on. So that was not something that I could rectify at the time. But otherwise, I'm really happy with the shot. It's simple, but I do think it has its own beauty. So again, I will be adding this one to my portfolio, I'm sure. The blue one again is quite nice. I would have been happy to put that in as well, but given the choice between the two, the sunlit one is my preference. Now this one is an interesting one because there's a lot that I don't like about it, and yet the color palette to me is so perfect, and there's this sort of sense of openness and simplicity that actually really appeals to me. So I'm a little bit torn on what to do with it, because my head says no and my heart says yes. Again, strong diagonal idea. I'll often look for these kind of very simple foregrounds when I'm in such obviously beautiful scenery. So there's a nice bit of geometry maybe here, just creating these triangles within the frame. However, there are a few things that I don't like, and the first is this area here, just a dead zone. I think I mentioned that actually in the video. There isn't really much there to break that area up. I mean, if there were to be some mountains in here or something, or some sort of layering effect, then that would help. But because it's all in shadow, and because there's no real crags in that area, it just creates a bit of a dead zone that I find a little bit uncomfortable. Although perhaps it's okay because we have this massive area of open snow. Now, is that too much? Possibly. I mean, does it need to be a square? Probably. And then you end up sort of cropping in and losing more of that foreground, and then suddenly it emphasizes this area more. And I just go back and forth with it. I'm not quite sure what the solution is with this one. Certainly if I'd sort of stood up and walked around the corner, then I could have reduced the amount of this foreground, maybe have the diagonal running down here, but then you would have increased this area here. So again, I think the compromise I met is a pretty good one, but it's not a perfect image, and I'll probably come back to this at another time and decide, have a sort of final decision on whether it's going to drop into my portfolio. This one I included as an interesting point of comparison. Once the sun has set and you've got the belt of Venus rising here, and incidentally this is the most spectacular belt of Venus I think I've probably seen, just insanely clear air quality. But once the sun has gone down and you lose those pinks in the foreground mountains, then it really puts strong emphasis on the color in the sky, and the foreground becomes even flatter to me. So whilst I think this is pretty in its own way, that emphasis to me is a bit unwanted, because I end up looking at the sky more than I do at the foreground, and this all feels very empty. So it needs that color, I think, to work well. Although maybe actually looking at this now, I'll have a look at the hue of these blues, because they look a little bit greeny to me here. Yeah, so that's another version shot at a different time of day. And then this was one of the foregrounds which early on I discovered that I thought was going to make for a great shot. In the end, I focused my efforts on other things until the belt of Venus appeared, and I started composing it in a similar way as I did in the video. So I'd kind of stood back so that I had this edge of Rime Ice, and then some empty snow at the bottom here. But in reality, when it came to shooting this later, I felt that line was too strong and a bit too much of a distraction, just too linear along the bottom of the frame as it was. So I moved in a bit closer to use the Rime Ice as a sort of wide angle foreground. And I don't know, the foreground here just is a bit ugly, I guess, to me, and there's other shots that I prefer. So again, this one's probably going to stay hidden on my computer. And finally, from that evening on Rundfjellet, this blue hour image, which I'm still really excited about. It was so beautiful being up there when the highest peaks are catching that strong directional light. Incredibly bright compared to the shadowed and lower areas of the mountains, and I just love that sort of natural glow you get. And this foreground texture was a real bonus to find so late on in the day. It was a lot further from the area that I'd been scouting whilst the sun was up prior to sunset. And I really did find it last minute and was happy that I did. And this was the first composition essentially that I shot whilst I was there, and whilst I played around for some time with different framing, shooting both portrait and landscape in slightly different locations. This was the composition that I felt was the best, that first one that I came across. So really happy with that one, and that's definitely gonna go straight into my portfolio. And finally, I finished with this shot of Harshen. A few people mentioned this was the the sort of hero shot where you put the figure in the frame to make it seem more dramatic. In this case, actually, it was because I wanted a wide view that made use of the position of the aurora, because a lot of it was off to the left here. In fact, it never really progressed further right than around here. So I needed to find compositions that worked in this direction. But if I go back to this previous image, this town here had become incredibly prominent. So it was lighting all of this rock face here and spilling light into this area. So if you see this set of mountains here is that set of mountains, and so I'm basically just blocking out the town using the snow formation, and Harshen seemed then like a good opportunity for a focal point to set the image off. So actually it wasn't really an attempt at creating an epic lifestyle image, though of course as soon as I had that idea, that was ultimately the goal, with Harshen actually pointing his head torch a little out of frame, so lighting this snow and just creating the right size of star with his headlight there. And to illustrate our adventure, I absolutely love this image. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with it, but I'm certainly very fond of it. I only wish it was me in the frame. Right, so now we're on to the next day's images. Oh no, we're not. So this is the last image I took on that day. A couple of people asked whether I'd shot landscapes. Yes, I did. This is probably the best one that I shot. Unfortunately, I slightly messed up my focus here, so the resolution starts to fall apart. In my defense, I was quite tired by that point. And ultimately, it's not an image that I'm too bothered about not getting sharp either. It's a nice illustrative shot, and of course the aurora are beautiful, but there'll be another day to take photos like this, I hope. Right, so on to the following day. This was the first shot I took up Mat Mora, which turned into much more of an epic than I had expected. You'll notice me initially understating the difficulty of the hike to come, which we consequently then struggled with both on time and difficulty. But this is the first shot that I took, and I quite like it. I don't know whether it'll end up in my portfolio or not yet, but I like the simplicity of the colour palette and all of these lovely shapes made by the snow. There's lots of flowing lines here, which I think really work well in combination. All these rounded shapes are great to use as compositional elements if you can find them. That's why snow can be such a lovely thing to photograph. And there's also that sense of perspective coming in from these diagonals as well, which all points into the mountains in the background. So I think compositionally this works pretty well. Not so sure about this big shadowed hillside on the right, but equally it's not a big issue either. One reason I might not include this in my portfolio is perhaps the final image I took was better. So we hiked up to our point of no continuance and had to stop because the route looked a bit too difficult for us. And this was one of the shots that I took as the sun started to come down. I did get a comment that some photographer preferred if snow formations would lead into the view, have this sort of effect going on, and so do I. But you have to work with what you have available to you, and this was one of the only sastrugi formations we found on the ridge. and it was quite a nice one too. These lines aren't static, they are dynamic. They've got a good diagonal nature to them, so it's not like a completely linear foreground, and I quite enjoyed photographing it continually as the sun came down. This was the shot that I took when this ridge was lit up, because that helped to break up what would otherwise be a massive swathe of shadow in this area here. And I think it works pretty well. Possibly I could have lost a bit more here, so put that ridge of snow just a little bit higher in the frame. I think that would have created a bit more coherence. But still, I quite like it. The color palette maybe isn't as nice as the later images though. So this was the landscape frame that I took when the light was at its absolute peak. It is the craziest pink image I have ever taken, quite exceptional color, and I'm very fond of it. I like to represent colors in a fairly natural way, and it's unusual that I end up with such incredibly intense pinks and reds as you see in this image. You do need unbelievable air clarity and snow and all of those good things. So I love it for those reasons. I also really like this foreground, the same dynamic lines as in the previous shot, and of course the peaks in the background. I quite like how they sort of end up almost creating a pyramid, so they feel very centralized and balanced. And mirrored. I think there's a good synergy between either side of this peak. So this mountain matches up with this one, and this mountain with this one to a certain extent. They actually work quite nicely together. I think it's quite balanced, and that can be very hard to find with wide mountain scenics like this. I say wide, actually. I think this was taken at a middle-ish focal length, but even so, it's nice to have a range of mountains that works so well together like that. So that's certainly a portfolio image. My favorite from Matt Mora was this particular shot. In a way, it happened more due to luck than good measure, or the idea came about in that way because I was thinking about shooting a different peak at a longer focal length, and I realized that the focus blend that I've been doing previously was just going to be an enormous effort because I was shooting at such a long focal length, and it sort of occurred to me maybe I could leave the foreground out of focus, and then consequently when it came to shooting this peak, I realized just how much that might actually bring to the image by adding this incredibly soft out of focus foreground. I think this only really works at twilight when the colors have come out of the foreground, because if you imagine this being bright pink and trying to blend into the blue, I think it would become far too strong and distracting. But as it is, it creates a really nice pastel color palette, and again with these pinks, and in contrast to that image I was discussing earlier, these pinks they add to the image. They don't distract from it. It's not a really strong, intense pink band. It's a lovely, subtle pastel pink, and so that really sets the rest of these blues off for me. And this is the kind of photo I'd hang up on my wall, to be honest. The subtlety is hard to find, and I'm really, really happy with this shot. And finally, when my sickness was really kicking in, and sorry for those of you who felt I made a meal of my illness, I'm one to complain if I'm feeling really under the weather, and that was certainly one of those days. So I guess this just feels a little bit lopsided to me, and there's so much of it that I think is beautiful that I might end up putting it in my portfolio anyway. But the way that this mountain is still relatively well lit with such a strong leading line coming into it makes, this more of the frame here, whereas I think the effect of the perspective from the wider view also adds something to the image, and I love these textures in the foreground and the way all these lines work together. I just wish that this wasn't in shadow to such a great extent. This incidentally being the mountain that we tried to go up. So there is a storytelling element to this image. So yeah, it feels a little bit unbalanced, but I love the color palette and the foreground in particular and all these textures. So I might end up just accepting this shot as a compromised image in my portfolio, because I just quite like it despite its failings. And it's worth mentioning, whilst I am critiquing my images, that landscape photography should always be a compromise, and having criticism for your own work is not an excuse for not enjoying it. So there are many of my images that I can critique that I still love despite their failings. And I think that that's a really important point to make. I know some people would possibly think that I'm hard on myself. It helps my work to improve by being hard on myself, if you want to call it that. But I also don't let my own critique or anybody else's get me down, because I have faith in what I produce and the compromises that I make. So hopefully all these critiques can be seen in those in that context, and hopefully you can critique your own work without being down on yourself. Because it's a great way to progress your photography. So that's the end of this critique, and I hope you found it interesting. Please do check out those blogs or vlogs from the Drakensberg. I really hope they are going to be well worth watching.